I believe that the removal of all legal protections for the unborn child, which is what this bill proposes, is one of the most pernicious pieces of legislation in a long line of pernicious pieces of legislation which has been foisted upon this part of Ireland in the history of British influence here. Those of you who were present at the last meeting in July will already have heard my defence of the right to life of the unborn, which I believe is the first and most fundamental human right. You'll have heard me speak of the pain and the beauty of human reproduction, and believe me, as anybody who's ever worked in the labour ward, they'll know about the pain part of it. Of the continuum of our lives from the earliest seconds through the development of the embryo in his or her mother's womb to where each of us sit this evening, and through that to our old age and inevitable death. You will have heard me speak of the irreplaceable role of fathers in this process and the rights and responsibilities which this involves, and you will be aware that 98% of abortions are carried out not for the tragic and thankfully quite rare cases for which any right-thinking person would have sympathy, such as babies who are unlikely to survive, but for healthy women with healthy babies. And we know that in this council area, 8,000 lives have been saved by the laws in our country which protect the lives of both mothers and their babies since the 1967 Act was introduced in Britain. And those 8,000 people matter to me. Many of these physically healthy women and physically healthy babies, of course, have real and urgent problems. We know that women seeking abortion are overrepresented in groups whose choices in every other aspect of their lives are limited by governmental failures, by matters such as poverty, lack of support, intimate partner violence, those from ethnic minorities, women who are trafficked, and those affected by the austerity policies and lack of real health care. So without ceding the validity of any of these arguments which have been debated in the public square in recent years, I wish to speak about another issue which I as an Irish Republican care about. And that is the right of people who live in a place to collectively shape the laws and rules under which they live their lives. Call it democracy, call it collective decision-making, call it bottom-up governance, whatever. And I think the people who are gathered here together, if they didn't believe in that principle, would be doing something else with their evening. These decisions are underpinned, of course, by core ethical principles by which mankind has been governed for tens of thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands of years, indeed since we started living together in communities. We agree that as far as possible that it is correct not to kill, not to steal, not to harm others, not to put ourselves and our families' position in front of those of other people for gain. We also understand, for example, that it's reasonable to care for the elderly, for the vulnerable, for the infirm, and to recognise the special role of family units as building blocks of society. Hippocrates, whose ethical principles still guide modern medical practice, formulated his oath, which still moves most medical practice, which condemned abortion some 500 years before the dawn of Christianity. Now, these core values, these ethical principles by which humanity have lived for millennia, have been overturned on many occasions, invariably without the consent of the people whose lives they affected. Never more than in the 20th century, and unfortunately the beginning of the 21st century doesn't augur very much better, when literally tens of millions of people died because of ideologies which rejected these fundamental truths. And I believe that abortion is one such ideology. Here in Ireland, and especially in the 6 counties, this last outpost of empire, we live in a contested space. The colonial legacy here has resulted in sectarianism and division, and especially since partition, when a border was drawn around a sectarian political affiliation headcount, we're bound by a system of governance whereby a gain for one side equally and oppositely entails a loss for the other, and where action and reaction are our daily fare. Our local legislature, in which some modicum of control over the lives of people was ceded to those who regard themselves as Irish, it wasn't granted, but it was wrung from the British government and their allies here over decades of conflict, which many in this chamber, including myself, remember all too well. That Stormont and the Assembly there was not going to work was predicted and predictable. The balancing powers of the North, South, East, West councils, which were meant to help forge some sort of a new society and which was supposed to bring people together, has in fact seemed to have made matters worse in the last 20 years. But those people, those MLAs who sought a mandate from the electorate in this council area and throughout the North, did not ask for votes on the basis that they would walk away from this task, impossible though it may seem. that they would pull down the house of cards rather than work in the best interests of their constituents and deliver health, social care, leisure facilities, employment and so on to people. So we instead have power blocks wrestling over culture wars which have really no effect on people's daily lives and failing in their duty to represent people. In the British Parliament, who's the mother of all parliaments, God help us when you look at the performances that have been going on there in recent days, they would call into question their understanding of anything, much less democracy. But we have the bizarre situation where Sinn Féin, who rightly say that they have a mandate as an abstentionist party, they travel to Westminster, they use proxy votes of English, Welsh and Scottish MPs to change laws here which are devolved issues. They take salaries, they use facilities, they lobby on a range of issues, and they're happy to use surrogate votes to impose laws here, even on issues as contentious and divisive as abortion law. And actually, in the most recent debate on this issue in Stormont, the decision was overwhelmingly not to change the current legislation. That was in 2016. Now, I've spoken obviously about the bullish way in which this was done and the distortion of the bill, with 17 minutes debate, no green papers, no white papers, nothing, no time allowed to discuss this most fundamental change which will be imposed on our country as to how we regard our fellow humans. The parliamentary officers, as the officers here do sometimes, said that this breached protocol, but this was overruled by the Speaker and the vote went ahead. Is this democracy? If Stormont is not reconvened by the 21st of October, the preborn human child, the person we all once were, will have no protections whatsoever in law in this land. An abortion on request will be legal until the point of viability, possibly to 28 weeks or beyond, depending on the legal interpretation. The North will have one of the most unregulated regimes in the world without the consent of the people who live here. Is this democracy? The dignity of the human child is considered to be secondary to the needs and wants of others, and their worth is not simply because they exist, but is dependent on the wants and expectations of others. It's dependent on their size, on their state of health, on their perceived future economic usefulness to society. Is this justice? We have laws, members, because states and governments have a duty to care for all their citizens, especially the weak and vulnerable and voiceless. Our laws formalise this duty. Decriminalisation, which sounds like a very civilised thing to cede, actually means that all protections, unfortunately human beings need protections against one another, because the strong will always put the rights of the weak secondary. In fact, I have a criminal record because I broke the law. It's a while ago, mind you. It concerned allowing my car to be driven by somebody without an insurance, but it was an illegal act, and I have a criminal record. I contend, as everybody knows, we have an epidemic of mental health problems and suicide which plague especially our young people, and indeed my sympathy, and I'm sure everybody would agree, that extends to yet another beautiful young Derry woman who lost her life this week by her own hand. Mental illness is a complex and multifaceted phenomenon, but I contend that the devaluation of the human condition, which things like this bill entails, is part of the narrative which lowers young people's self-worth. The relentless assertion in the past decade by powerful groups that man is not a part of evolution, is not entitled to his space on this planet, must affect people's notion of who they are. Our young are being fed a constant narrative that they are a threat, that they are a problem, that they are not wanted, that they are a user of resources, a polluter. And this, certainly in my experience, feeds into the nihilism and feeling of disjointedness from all of creation. What are we telling our children when we afford more legal protection to birds' eggs and badgers than to they in their preborn state? We want to campaign for real support for women and for men who choose lives for their babies. In conclusion, I ask you to support this motion and demand that those who are being tasked and paid to govern listen to the people, allow for democracy to take its place in this place, and they should put aside their differences, go back to work and stop this legislation. Interestingly, this is one issue where Orange and Green speak with one voice. We ask you to join together, Protestant, Catholic, dissenter and everyone else to assert that this legislation will not be brought forward in our name. Thank you.